Be hanging out in the hood.
Hi, welcome to Almost Cooperstown.
I'm Mark.
And this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball. So, a really long-running debate that we've had that's been going back, it's got to be going back kind of years now at this point, and it was really one of the impetuses for starting this entire endeavor, was we've always kind of wondered how the advent of the reliever affected batting averages. And that has like a couple different elements to it when you think about it, right?
Well, maybe the modern reliever, right? Because there have been relievers, but not specialty the way that it became.
More so just the idea of that you can expect to see a reliever in every game. And certainly nothing like, the ancient days of baseball where teams had like one or two pitchers
Not
total.
If you pitch for the Padres on Friday night and your name is Joe Musgrove.
Right,
you don't need any relievers.
Right, but that's he is the exception to the rule. You're not talking about like back in like 1910 where like whatever team had like literally two pitchers on the roster.
Right. Guys would get, I think, Iron Joe McGinnity and some of these, old Hoss Rathborn had 50 starts in a year.
Right. And so the idea being basically within that a pitcher throwing that much is going to lose effectiveness.
You would think, and you're exactly right. We did kind of talk about this because we expected that a tired pitcher would allow, for a hitter late in the game maybe to take advantage.
And so this has been something we've always wondered, and I was actually rather shocked to find that we are able to actually pull the by inning statistics for most of the players for a career aggregate. Now, unfortunately, some of the most interesting players to look at, we don't have statistics for. So like a guy like Honus Wagner played at a time where we just don't have the game.
Reporting was a little spotty back then.
Right. And even a guy like Ty Cobb, who we wanted to look at, like I think when I looked over his career statistics, for by inning, we only had like about a third to a half of his career at bats. Right. So I dropped those guys off of this because I really wanted to focus on guys that we could say we definitively had their whole career tracked for.
So we're not going to talk about Ty Cobb.
We're not going to talk about Ty Cobb because it just, how could we really be fair in that? We're missing half of his career at bats from the beginning part of his career where you could argue, he's in some of his prime. So that just didn't ever feel fair to me.
But I do remember looking at his stats. And so it was Cobb's career 366, which will never be equaled or surpassed. And we all think that we felt, or I felt at the division, I think we both did, that it was probably, affected by the late inning games, where he got hits more than maybe he did in the first 6 innings. And that actually, even in the career we were able to pull off of him, didn't necessarily bear out the way that we thought.
Yeah, I mean, because looking at his stats actually specifically for that, he hit 355 in the first 3 innings, 338 in innings 4 through 6, and 376 in innings 7 through 9.
And for the years that we have recorded, which I think we didn't have like the first 8 years of his career.
Like Ty Cobb had for his total in his career, he had 13,000 or like 11,000 at bats. We have about 3,000 at bats tracked.
Right. But at least the ones that we do have support the idea that
but unfortunately we're missing almost 75% of his career. Actually, now that I look at it, it's even worse. So these are the players I have for our historical perspective, just to kind of run you through the names. We have Babe Ruth.
That's pretty historical.
Joe DiMaggio, Willie Mays.
Anybody not from New York?
We do have a couple. Hank Aaron.
Okay, good.
Ted Williams.
Definitely not from New York.
We do go back to New York for Lou Gehrig.
Okay, yep.
Stan Musial.
Oh.
Al Kaline.
These are fantastic names.
Mickey Mantle. And we end it with Frank Robinson.
Oh, okay. Well, that is a terrific layout of players.
I wanted to go with these guys because these guys across the board were also really good hitters. So variations in their average could be less explained to them just being inconsistent hitters. Like if we were looking at 250 hitters across the board, you might see more natural variation in their averages between innings because they're just not very good. Where all of these guys are good, so they're consistent. But then to compare, I wanted to give a mix of modern guys to look at. So we're going to look at Mark McGwire, A-Rod, Barry Bonds, Pujols, Chipper Jones, Cal Ripken, Miguel Cabrera, Ken Griffey Jr., Frank Thomas, and Manny Ramirez.
So everybody in that group is a Hall of Famer except for Manny, Chipper's a Hall of Famer.
Chipper's
now.
a Hall of Famer. Miggy
and Cabrera.
And Cabrera, who will be a Hall of Famer.
Will be a Hall of Famer, yes.
And then we've got two extra guys we'll take a look at whose careers kind of, because in a lot of ways it's interesting. Part of this discussion has to go into when did relievers kind of become something you saw in most games.
Yeah, I think in one of our prior podcasts, I remember when I was a kid, they talked about the reliever being a fireman, and that was a big thing. Oh, he gets fireman. They even had an award like Fireman of the Year. This was before the save became...
The save became an official statistic in 1980.
69.
I think they didn't start tracking it until the 80s, though.
I think Bill Singer of the Dodgers got the first save in 1969. So that's the beginning of divisional play. It makes sense that they would do something like that. I don't think it was 1980.
Yeah, I thought it was
because
later.
Raleigh Fingers was getting saves for the A's back when. That's the first relief pitcher I remember as being like, whoa.
Bill Singer was the first recorded pitcher in 1969. You are correct.
And the A's won those 3 championships in 72, 3, and 4. As much behind Raleigh Fingers' amazing mustache and his great relief pitching.
But the difference was nobody counted it as an important statistic because it was too... The criteria wasn't specific enough. It was too easy to qualify because there was a save like Ron Taylor for the Mets got a save in a 20-6 game.
Dr. Ron Taylor. Yeah, that's sort of like the game-winning RBI stat there, it sounds like a little bit.
Right. So they tightened it to make it closer to the modern rules, and that was in 74.
Okay.
So that was kind of when relievers started to become more of a you started to see them consistently. You could expect within the run of a game that a reliever was going to come in at some point.
Right.
Instead
you
of
had your guys like Lee Smiths and your Jeff Reardons were your relievers that got on the all-time saves list, and they were like Reardon was like near the top. And a lot of people haven't even heard of Jeff Reardon. He's got over 300 career saves. At one time, I think he might have had the most.
And guys, back then, you would have one reliever that threw a lot of innings. You didn't have like the top relievers in the league. I think like there was one year where a guy threw like 138 innings in relief. Right. And then like for most of the late 2000s, I think like Pedro Feliciano would lead the league in innings pitched.
Right.
And he'd be like
that 88
92.
One year. Yeah, right, 92.
Like guys just didn't throw that many innings. Yep. So looking at this, we'll just start kind of going into the numbers. So we'll start with the highest career WAR player. We can really say, and that is Babe Ruth, who was a career 342 hitter. So when we look at his splits, only hit 334 in the first 3 innings, 343 in innings 4 through 6, and 365 in innings 7 through 9.
Okay.
So you're starting to see, boom, guy right there, one of the earlier players in his career. You can see the effect that it had for him when there were no relievers.
So I know. Are you going to go down the list because you said highest WAR, and I thought, doesn't Barry Bonds have the highest?
I think.
WAR?
I think Bonds might strip him, but some people.
So all I wanted to do is to be interesting to compare the two of them since you've got them from different eras.
No, Ruth has 182.
Okay.
Bonds has 162.
Yep.
But we can look at Bonds right now. So Bonds has a career 298 average, and then when we look at his by inning stats, he was 306 in innings 1 through 3, 304 in innings 4 through 6.
The last 3 have to be worse.
283 in innings 7 through 9.
Interesting.
So I think you're going to see that a lot with the modern guys.
And when did Bonds play? In the age of dominant relief
in the
pitchers.
age of specifically late game relievers,
and not even
like
as it is today.
Not even as bad as it is today. But he played in the era of closers, where like every team had a dominant closer. But to kind of go back, so we have another older guy. Now he played a little bit later on compared to Ruth, obviously. But this is Joe DiMaggio. He was a career 325 hitter. So he's another guy. Now, here's where it kind of gets interesting because this is where not everything was exact. So, again, 321 hitter in the first 3 innings. Okay. 324 in the last.
Oh, he must have killed it in the last 3 innings.
328.
Wait,
321, 324,
so
328. He was super consistent. He got a little bit better, but that variation is nothing like the variation we saw with Ruth.
Mm-hmm.
So
or Bonds,
or Bonds, yeah. And then we have another guy. Now, this is obviously many people would consider the greatest hitter of all time, Ted Williams.
Yep.
So 344 career hitter, which I mean, just right there, I think not enough people appreciate how nutty that is when he was doing that.
Right, because after Cobb, I think Wagner has an average that's probably up that high, but I would say Williams has got to have one of the highest career averages.
Right, and this is where it gets really interesting. 347 in innings 1 through 3. 348 in innings 4 through 6. 323 in innings 7 through 9. So he gets 20 points worse in the last 3 innings.
That's interesting. Now, you know, we're not getting into when guys did that in their careers. We'll get back to Williams in a second, but in Bonds' case, I wonder how much his average has changed in the first half of his career and the second half of his career when he took all the walks. Remember, he walked so much, and so everything was inflated. He had that crazy year with average where he batted 370.
And if anything, it would lead him to having a worse overall average because he would be more likely to walk early in the game than later in the game.
Yeah, another question you could wonder about, is that true? I don't even know, because wouldn't you as a manager, like, you know what, I want nothing to do with Bonds when the game's on the line.
At the same time, there would be more opportunities, I feel like, where you would have to pitch to him because you couldn't afford to put a guy on base.
Yeah. Well, so back to Williams. So what would have been distinguishing about that time? Yeah, well, you know, Williams lost, I think, almost 3 years in the service in the prime of his career.
Right.
So I don't know what his post, service statistics were versus his pre-service statistics. He was pretty young when he went in the service, so most of his career was after the service, I believe.
Now, you could also say it looks like he was just supremely unlucky in the last innings of the.
Give me a BABIP stat here.
Yeah, so he was a 343 batting average on balls in play in innings 1 through 3, 332 in innings 4 through 6, 296. Innings 7 through 9.
The guys just fielded really well at the end of the game.
So he apparently just got supremely unlucky also.
Well, actually, and Williams is a guy who you probably know was famous for having them devise the shift for him. The Ted Williams shift was a thing.
And so I wonder if, considering the way the shift was historically looked at, I wonder if it was the kind of thing that became more acceptable later on into the game to invoke, because it was like a tighter game. So now playing that, because like you used to never see teams take shifts early in games.
Right, and I don't know if that's a great question in my mind too. Did the Ted Williams shift happen early in his career or late in his career when he would hit it into the shift and hit it so hard he'd get a base hit anyway? Williams was such a great hitter.
Yeah, but I mean, there's still lots of great hitters. I mean, like you had Willie Mays, who was a career 302 hitter, but then you get to, once you go to by the innings, you have him as a 297 hitter in innings 1 through 3, and also innings 4 through 6. But a 316 hitter or 313 hitter in innings 7 through 9.
That's interesting. And he played the bulk of his career before the age of relievers.
Yeah, like because he played for, that's a hard thing with Willie, is he played for so long.
22 seasons, I think.
Yeah, like, and he played just so that also makes it like really difficult to like totally like evaluate him, because he had a lot of, especially years towards the end of his career where he really wasn't playing that much.
But you could begin to try to unpack, is having a 316 average in the last 3 innings compared to his 297 in the first 6 frames, is that a sign of clutchness?
It might be. I mean, then you've got Hank Aaron, who, again, I think this is less a thing of clutch, but this is just more the hypothesis showing that there is some correlation, because Hank Aaron was a 305 hitter, except he hit 292 in innings 1 through 3, 306 in innings 4 through 6, and 318 in innings 7 through 9.
Defying it. So
boom, boom, boom. Gets better as the game goes on.
But and again, so those would be the kind of things I'd expect seeing in Honus Wagner's record and Ty Cobb's record if we had his whole career. That he and it does lean that way.
Even with a guy like Aaron, you have to remember, he played at a time while there were relievers. I have to imagine, with the way professional sports and baseball particularly have been, relievers weren't like good pitchers back then. They were the guys that just weren't good enough to be starters.
You're 100% right. And complete games were
still the dominant.
And these guys came up in the early 50s.
So if a reliever was in, you were still probably, even facing a reliever, you were still probably facing an inferior pitcher to a tired starter.
Right, taking out your starter wasn't going to get better if you bring in a relief pitcher who was not even half the pitcher.
But I mean, you can still go back. I mean, here's a guy that comes from a time where, I mean, Stan Musial definitely was playing at a time where there weren't a lot of relievers.
No, absolutely. He came up in the late 40s.
And he was a career 330 hitter, 333 hitter.
Yeah.
331.
331, yeah.
So now this is where it's interesting, and this is where I think with some of the older guys, it can be a little bit off because he was a 330 hitter in innings 1 through 3, a 331 hitter in innings 4 through 6, and a 327 hitter in innings 7 through 9.
That's consistent. That's statistically
Yeah.
really insignificant.
It's statistically insignificant because the thing is you have to remember is, yes, he hit worse innings through 7 through 9, but you're going to generally take less at bats because very often you won't get any at bats at all in the ninth inning.
And was a pitcher really giving Stan Musial something to hit in those last 3 innings, particularly on the Cardinal teams in which he was the big time hitter?
So that tells you the dude could just hit.
Well, he wasn't called Stan the Man for nothing.
So it tells you he was just going to hit no matter who he faced. And there really wasn't, like, suddenly facing a worse pitcher wasn't going to really change that.
Wasn't it in that book that we talked about in one of our earlier podcasts that I gave you, Strange But True Baseball Stories, where was it that the book where Musial was playing outfield and he ran into the wall in the minor leagues and he comes back holding his shoulder. He was a pitcher, primarily, and so a guy goes, "Oh my God, he ran into the wall," and he watched Musial get up later in the game and crack a base hit or two and go, "That man's not a pitcher, that man's a hitter." Yeah, that would be Stan Musial.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of hitters, we had Mickey Mantle. And I mean, here's another guy that the hypothesis plays out for. He's a 298 career hitter, except he hit 289 in the first 3 innings, 297 innings 4 through 6, 307 in innings 7 through 9. So you could see for some guys, it definitely made a difference.
All right, so let's see. Can you figure out what I'm thinking now? When I hear about Mantle, I think about his career. I think about first half of his career and second half of his career. And what would the differences be? Did they get better or worse in latter stages of the game as their career went on, or was it the same?
Mm-hmm. There's still, we got one more historical player to really go through, and that's Al Kaline. 297 career hitter. I think a lot of people don't, and yeah, he's another guy. What's interesting, what's with a first baseman kind of being like this? Because he's kind of similar to Musial, because Musial was a first baseman, right?
Musial was an outfielder.
Okay, I thought he was a first baseman too.
Nope.
But 297 career hitter, 297 innings 1 through 3, 296 innings. 299 innings 4 through 6, 296 innings 7 through 9.
He fell down in those last 3.
Just, dude consistently hit.
Yeah, and Kaline was a guy who had 400 career home runs. I think a great all-time great, and passed away and probably doesn't get his due outside of the baseball community as one of the great players of all time.
Interestingly, most of his power came in the first inning. He had 74 career home runs in the first inning alone. And that was the most he had in any inning.
Interesting.
Now, granted, it makes sense because he's guaranteed to get the most at bats in the first inning if he's hitting in the 3 spot.
That is true. And with all the great starters that these guys were facing, each team probably had 2 great starters, and then they had, 2 or 3 other pitchers that would be starting pitchers, that guys that were great hitters would probably have a lot easier time than trying to get hits off Drysdale and Koufax. People like that were so Gaylord Perry and Marichal.
But those guys, they had to face those incredible starters, but they didn't have to face all those incredible relievers that all of the current players have had to face. So you look at a guy like A-Rod, who was a career 295 hitter. I think some people forget he was a good average hitter. So he hit 295 in his career, 289 in the first 3 innings. So,
So he obviously got better.
313
in the middle innings.
281 innings 7 through 9.
And again, another guy who's early. The first half of his career statistically was mind-boggling, as many guys would play.
Just like the next guy we're going to go over.
Right. And so you wonder how different it was as time went on.
Yeah, because Albert Pujols is a career 298 hitter, but if you just isolate that nutty stretch he had at the start of his career, it'd be something even wackier. But even he is a guy, 298. He hit 294 in the first 3 innings, 310 in innings 4 through 6, 291. Innings 7 through 9. So I think that's what you're going to see with a lot of the modern players, is that their middle innings are where they really feast, because that's where you're either knocking out a starting pitcher that's having a poor performance, or you're feasting on the less powerful parts of the opponent's bullpen.
And I think it would hold up that the hitters, let's say since 2000, maybe.
Yeah.
And that's using Pujols as a really good poster child for that, because he came up in 01, I think. That those players will almost, I don't know if you'll be able to find a player who's probably be only worth looking at really good players that has an average that's higher in the last 3 years.
You're not going to see it. Chipper Jones, 303 career hitter, 308, 308, 290.
Right.
It plays out the same for all of them. Manny, another unbelievable 312 career average, but you get down to those once you look at by inning, 310, 333, 290. That's a 43-point drop.
So what makes me think about it jumping up that much is that, okay, so let's say Ramirez is in the game, and the first time through the order, the pitcher gets through 3 innings, he hits 313. The same pitcher's in there. Second, third time through the order, innings 4 through 6, the starting pitcher's still in there. Matty jumps up to 333, and then the relievers come pouring on at the end of the game, and he drops down. And that's could be a trend you might see.
And that's what you see across all of them. Frank Thomas was a career 301 hitter. He hit 311 in the first 3 innings, 304 in the 4 through 6, 282 7 through 9.
I think what's really more surprising is expected it to be sort of universal that the players from the first half of the 20th centuries would have much higher averages, but it necessarily didn't work out that way.
No,
there's probably a few reasons for that.
But we are seeing what is universal is that when you look at the modern players, like Miguel Cabrera is a career 313 hitter, but when you look at him by inning, he goes 312, 323, 303. So all of them you're seeing pretty much play out the exact same pattern. They're good in the first 3 innings, get better in the middle innings, and then they all have a precipitous drop off in the last 3 innings.
Which is probably the most significant thing is that the end of the game is where they're going to drop off. I think you mentioned one player whose average actually went up in the middle 3 innings from the first inning. So went down.
Frank Thomas.
But that's really, again, 304, 311. 311. You're talking about not that many hits over the course of a career.
Right. Even a guy like you have a guy like Miguel Cabrera who drops 20 points going from 4 through 6 to 7 through 9. He's still a 300 hitter. He's still an incredibly dangerous hitter late in the game, but he's not quite as dangerous a hitter because he's facing better opposition. And so to kind of close up, I did just want to look at 2 players. I had 2 more guys that I wanted to go through. And these were guys whose careers kind of bisected the age of relievers in my mind. They played at a time when when they started off their careers, a guy like Mike Schmidt. When he started off his career, I mean, there were relievers, but it wasn't an ever-present thing. But by the time he finished his career, relievers regularly pretty much.
I think that's right, because if you look at what we said, Raleigh Fingers, right, in the mid-'70s, so Schmidt comes up around, I think, the mid-'70s, 76 or something like that. I don't remember which year it was. But by the time he finished, relief pitchers were, you guys were getting 40, 50 saves a year.
Yeah, and you can tell he was just, but again, you can see that reflected in his stats. He was a 267 career hitter. That was it. That's actually lower than I thought he would be. But 270, 267, 268. Just consistent.
Yeah.
So he wasn't so then the only other guy I wanted to take a look at was Joe Morgan. Because he was another guy that kind of played.
Late, great Joe Morgan.
Yeah. He was a 271 career hitter.
Yeah.
And so he was 263, 283, 265. So he had a career track similar to more of the modern players.
And he came up before Schmidt.
He came up, but I think he played a little bit longer than him.
A little bit, but Morgan was playing for the Astros back in the early 60s. So, he didn't. So that's actually a little surprising. His late game,
Now, with all of the historical players, you have to understand. I pulled all these numbers from Baseball Reference. So for all the modern players, we're assured that their data is complete. For any of the players that played before 72 specifically, they can't promise that all of the data is complete. So we might be missing some number of at bats for those historical players' averages, but it would be impossible for a number to be introduced to vastly change the averages. You know what I mean?
But you made the point off air that, hey, we forget sometimes that players themselves get tired as the game goes on and even as the season goes on. And so the idea that the player would be completely impervious to the change and would just face a tiring pitcher, well, you're not crediting at all the fact that so often
when we talk about baseball, we only talk about people getting tired strictly in terms of the pitcher. Only the pitcher is allowed to get tired.
Right.
A batter can't ever be tired.
Right,
We don't view their job
right.
as difficult.
And what we didn't do, and I'm curious enough that I might try to poke around, is let's look at what happened in the first half of the season versus the second half of the season. You would think,
But there's competing. There's competing ideas in there because people would say it's easier to hit in the first half of the season when the pitchers haven't really warmed up yet and they're still getting into their full shape. And then the second half, I mean, think about how many dominant second half pitchers we've seen when they get into those dog days of summer and they just start getting unhittable.
And it goes the other way. Okay, so I'm going to go the completely opposite on you. So early in the season, even this season, the pitchers seem to be ahead of the hitters. The hitters are struggling in general. But you get into the dog days of summer and all of a sudden the ball starts flying farther. Pitchers are a little tired. They give up more runs and they can't make it through the dog days of August because, the balls. So it can go both ways.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to see the same thing if you look at like in their careers, like if early in their career they get better as later into the game, but then as they get older it switches because they get tired more easily.
I'm going to take a look at that. Like, I want Bonds in particular. I think it would be very interesting to look at his career,
just because he changed so drastically as a player too.
Correct, right, physically and just performance wise. I mean, he was a great player before that, but that one season where he batted 370 and his on base average was almost near 900 or something like that. That's so off the charts versus everybody else. It's like Gretzky's 92 goals.
Right, where it's almost hard to like evaluate that season because it's such an outlier season. Like, but then Bonds is just an outlier player. He's like, it's almost like with Ruth, where like sometimes when you're talking about them statistically, you just have to remove them from the pool of all of the regular humans because like I remember watching, it was a video from, I want to say it was a Bleacher Report video, but it could have been like a Grantland video, but they were basically going over Barry Bonds' like that 370 season where he was nutting and how like nobody will ever approach that again, like in terms of his on base, like they basically calculated that he would have been he would have had like a higher, if he just didn't swing at any pitches, he still would have been like a 300 on base guy.
Yeah, I really, think it's great to talk about Bonds as a player and his exploits on the field because so much of every conversation you get to Bonds has to end up talking about performance enhancing,
right. But performance enhancing drugs didn't make him able to see the ball that well.
Exactly, and the guys wouldn't pitch to him. They just simply wouldn't pitch. He knew he was going to walk, and he had all the armor out there.
But regardless, I think it still comes back to the idea, at least with this, when you see that, the advent of relievers have changed how hitters have hit. That's the key thing. I think it's less that old school pitchers would get super tired. Even though we see a good deal of evidence for that, there are still plenty of guys that hit just pretty much the same. So certainly there was no net negative to the batter.
So here's what I'll do is I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at some great pitchers. And since we know they pitched a lot of the
see
whole
if they're
game, look at Christy Mathewson, look at Walter Johnson, some of these.
Look at his batting average.
Look at their ERAs
in those last couple
in the
innings,
last three innings and how much better or worse. Now these are great pitchers. Chances are they were probably great the whole game.
Right, but you're going to see it's going to be like, he went from like 2.15 in the first three innings to like 230 to 245.
And that's if we can get this data, which as you pointed out, is tough to get.
Ultimately, what is true though is that with relievers now appearing more and more, averages go down as relievers come in.
That is in conclusion.
And that's why we have relievers. Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.
And you can follow us on Twitter at AlmostCoop.